Right, good morning for those of you participating on the conference West Coast time. Good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast and elsewhere. This is Sociolinguistics IV. There will be 3 presented papers during this session, starting with substrate effects and diachrony back vowels during long-term language shifts in Finnish-Canadian enclaves, followed by linguistic inequities, an audit study of 3 American dialects in the housing market, and phonetic contrast in Unterland Yiddish vowels. We will be starting with substrate effects and diachrony back vowels during long-term language shift in a Finnish-Canadian enclave by Marisa Brooks at University of Toronto and Mirva Johnson at University of Wisconsin-Madison. You have the floor.
Okay, thanks so much, Taylor, and everyone else for being here today. We're really excited to get to share this data with the world. Okay, looks like that's ready now. Okay. So when we have a situation where language shift yields a new regional dialect or an ethnolect, it's often the case that there are long-lasting influences from that substrate on the new variety. Studies of this when it comes to North American English include German and Norwegian in the Midwest, Italian and Finnish in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and Spanish in Latinx populations in the United States that have shifted to using mostly English. Now, language contact scenarios are all different, of course, but a big question is which features are likely to linger as substrate influences over the long term? How long do they remain? And what are they in terms of levels of the grammar and so on? In order to address this question and related questions, we need close observation of what is occurring on the ground in specific communities. One thing that can be done is to zero in on communities that are small, isolated, and enclosed. Caroline Myrick, for instance, highlights English as spoken on the small Caribbean island of Saba. She quotes Schreier 2013 saying, "Even minor varieties represent test sites to test current theories on contact linguistics developed on major varieties." So in this vein, we introduce our case study, Language Shift in the small remote town of Sointula, British Columbia, Canada, which has a distinctive history. So I'm going to turn this over to Mirva to talk about the history of the settlement and the linguistic situation of it in general. And then it'll be back to me to discuss our pilot study and the results and the conclusions. Okay.
So, northwest from Seattle, over the Canadian border, is Vancouver Island. The city of Victoria is in the southeastern corner and is the capital of the province of British Columbia. And it draws a lot of tourism in particular. So from that corner to the northern end of Vancouver Island is about an 8-hour drive, and most people from the southern end of the island have never been up there. So getting to Sointula not only requires driving to the northern rural half of this island, but taking a 30-minute ferry ride to Malcolm Island, located just off the coast, where Sointula is the largest town. It had a population of just over 500 in 2016, but that number has been declining. And so Malcolm Island looks like this. It is stunning, and with parts of Vancouver Island in the background. This is the traditional land of the Nove peoples, and small numbers of European migrants had previously attempted to settle on Malcolm Island, but most of those efforts didn't last. Until a group of Finnish immigrant laborers, dissatisfied with working conditions in Vancouver Island coal mines, organized to establish a cooperative utopian commune, actually one of a few of the time period. They purchased land on Malcolm Island from the BC government and began settlement in 1901. The community was founded on values of collective labor, gender equality, secularism, and cooperation. The original endeavor only lasted until 1904, when half of the settlers abandoned the colony, in part because of rift in leadership, but there's also a devastating fire. But many remained, and people continued to move to the island. The mid-century arrivals from Finland were less radical and more supportive of religion than the founders had been, and helped ensure the longevity of the Finnish language in Sointula. In the 1950s and 1960s, Sointula opened up more and more with better access to electricity and phones. Steamships were replaced with regular ferries in 1958, giving easier access between Malcolm Island and Vancouver Island. The town attracted many looking for a non-conformist hideaway in the 1960s and 1970s, a mix of hippies, artists, communists, and a handful of Americans looking to avoid Vietnam. So that was a bit of social history. Linguistically, this means the town and island are in the end stage of language shift from Finnish to English. The BC government had made early attempts to insist children learn English. However, even by 1940, there were still many that were more fluent in Finnish. There are some anecdotes that reported of a teacher trying to ban speaking of Finnish on school grounds even. In a community history book from 1958, Sointula was reported as already having shifted from a mainly Finnish to a mainly English-speaking community. And then further in 2016, the 500 people in Sointula reported being English speakers. Only 25 of those reported also being able to speak Finnish. While there are few speakers now, there are still signs of Finnish heritage in the community, most notably in bilingual welcome signs when you get off the ferry, as well as placards on community structures detailing the history of different buildings significant to the community's development. Linguistically, the community is almost unstudied. The sole exception is Pauliina Saarinen's 2009 thesis on consonants in Sointula heritage Finnish. But the history of Sointula and its settlement has made it a goldmine for oral history projects over the decades. And the Royal British Columbia Museum and the BC Archives hold recordings of 21 interviews with Sointula residents that were made between 1967 and 1988. Most of these are pretty substantial, and notably, they have never before been studied by linguists. So we have combined these with new sociolinguistic fieldwork in both languages conducted in July of 2018. Marisa interviewed 18 people in English, and I interviewed 9 speakers of Finnish. In other words, we have overlapping synchronic and diachronic data, yielding what Alex Darcy terms a longue durée view of language shift, straddling 2 languages. And notably, the birth dates of the interviewees we have span more than 100 years and include some of the earliest settlers. So our data set includes both these archival recordings and our new recordings of interviews spanning all the way from Katri Riksman, one of the earliest arrivals, born in 1879, and she never learned English. And from her all the way to one of the youngest interviewed by Marisa, Tessa Muldoon, pseudonym, born in 1988 and never learned Finnish. There's further some literal overlap between the archival recordings and our more recent ones, as one of the consultants we found to interview was also in the oral history archive thanks to a recording from the 1980s. So the big linguistic question about Sointula English is whether Tessa Muldoon's, the youngest speakers, her English still bears traces of Finnish if there's a substrate influence. Paula Wild is a historian rather than a linguist, but in her book on the community, she pauses to observe that in Sointula, much of the spoken English has a distinctly Finnish inflection. So there's various anecdotal accounts of there being some kind of influence. So we are asking, to what extent are there substrate effects of Finnish on English now? Are there ongoing influences of Finnish on English in Sointula, even in speakers with minimal or no exposure to the Finnish language? The closest comparison is Will Rankinen's work for the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. He found evidence consistent with substrate effects of Finnish on English, and we are expecting to find similar findings here. So now I will hand it back over to Marisa to discuss details of our pilot study.
Okay. So we have a number of potential sources of input when it comes to what English would end up being, how it would end up being shaped, and what it would end up looking like in Sointula. And the situation isn't resolved. It's still in flux. It's something that's going to be continuing into the subsequent decades. However, we have data of a sort that often isn't available in the first place, and we have a population that is small, geographically self-contained, and that has homogeneous founders in terms of the ethnic and linguistic background. This is a case of what Trudgill 2004 calls a tabula rasa, a blank slate scenario. Suddenly, this language is being spoken in this part of the world where it never was before. The English in the earliest or English language oral history interviews is very L2. It's very Finnish influenced. And so we predict that there are traces of that endure into the L1 English of the community more recently. Where to look for substrate effects? We begin with vowels. This is where a large proportion of dialectical differences between varieties of English are located in the first place, including when it comes to the possibility of substrate effects. This also allows for a straightforward comparison with Will Rankinen's study of Upper Peninsula English. Here we're reporting on our pilot study of the phonemes U and O. These are phonemes that are found in both languages, and so we expect them to be sensitive to substrate influence. They were also something that came across as very salient to me when I was listening to the oral history interviews. They stood out as something worth targeting for a preliminary investigation. So here's what Rankinen found for Upper Peninsula English in Michigan relative to homeland Finnish data from the 1960s. We're going to return to this, but for now, when it comes to U and O, just what to pay attention to here is that the U from Finnish relative to the U in English and the O in Finnish relative to the O the O in Finnish relative to the O in English, so show some differences here. So we'll come back to this, but what we expect in general is U and O are fronter in English and fronting still, but they may be held back a little bit by the positions of the counterpart phonemes in the Finnish substrate. Okay, methodologically speaking, we started off by doing a lot of the work by hand. I was a little bit skeptical about how well the Montreal Forced Aligner would work on legacy data. So a lot of it is noisy and subject to prior recording standards and technologies. I needn't have worried. It handled it like a champion. It had no problem with it at all. But having started off being cautious, we began transcribing in Elon or Prod. These data are not yet normalized. So in order to compensate for that, we've selected 13 speakers who are female presenting and whose voices are within the same general pitch range. This was very easy to ensure. Maybe it's genetic overlap, but I could hardly tell them apart auditorily. They're all in very similar sort of general pitch range. We used 2 Sointula heritage Finnish speakers as a baseline for the Finnish substrate locally, and 11 Sointula English speakers born between 1905 and 1988, taken from the contemporary interviews we did in 2018 and oral history archives from before then. For each speaker, beginning at least 5 minutes into the sociolinguistic interview, we collected 60 tokens, so 30 of stressed O in syllables and 30 of stressed U in syllables. We disregarded any that had an adjacent liquid or glider vowel for fear of co-articulation effects with something very sonorous next to it, and we restricted the potential influence of any particular lexical item to 5 tokens to avoid anything disproportionately affecting the results. After that, we used a prot script created by Mietalenes to delineate the vowels, so to go into the syllable, find the vowel, and extract formant values at 3 points over the course of its trajectories, 25%, 50%, and 75%. Revisiting specific hypotheses, both vowels are fronting in North American English and other dialects of English. U fronting is better studied, but both of these things are reported to be happening. So we expect that this change will eventually have reached Sointula English as the community has opened up and shifted to become English dominant. However, as in the UP, consistent with Rankinen's interpretation, there may be a bit of a counterweight effect. The Finnish may literally be holding these vowels back a little bit relative to what we would expect from rural BC English alone without the Finnish substrate. Okay, so on to the results. I'm going to fill in all of these cells. So we're going to talk about what O is doing in terms of height, in terms of backness, and in terms of the Euclidean distance between the 25% and the 75% mark. I'm going to do the same for U, and then we'll look at some visualization that will help untangle this a little bit. One thing that needs to be mentioned up front is that my decision to focus on 2 Sointula heritage Finnish speakers in order to capture the substrate did not have the intended effect. Rather, it seems that recent bilingual speakers have Finnish that has been heavily influenced by English. So we will see the Finnish speakers on all of these graphs, but what we'll mostly see is not so much that they're speaking Finnish in a way that would have modeled the substrate, but that their Finnish has been influenced by how English is spoken in the community. So more work to follow there, but that's something that needs to be mentioned right away. Okay, so in terms of O, in terms of height, F1 is going up. The Finnish speakers, we can see that they're distinct from each other. So there are 2 of them there, they're from different generations, and each of them their finish falls within the range for this vowel that we would more or less expect given their generation and given what their English is doing. And this is something we'll see time and again here. So O is lowering a little bit over time. The F2 is rising. Is O fronting? It wasn't, and then suddenly it was. Now, there are only so many people who grew up in Sointula in recent decades, and of those who have, most of them have left. So we only have a few speakers representing younger generations. But of the 2 English and 1 Finnish speaker we have, we can see something really different has started to take hold. So, and our younger Finnish speaker patterns more or less with the much more fronted O here. In terms of the diphthonginess, so the degree of diphthongization of O, this is something that's been generally declining. And we'll have to revisit this shortly when we talk about the trajectories in 2 dimensions. But we see O is becoming more monophthongal, which is something that will need to be addressed separately from everything else. Okay, now we go on to U. So U is like O, it's lowering a little bit. Is U fronting? Yes, it is. No one born after 1950 has an U with an F2 of under about 1200 hertz. And the youngest speaker, Tessa Muldoon, her U is so far forward, phonetically, we're into the Bard U range of part of the vowel space here. So we're not quite as far forward as U, but it's going in that direction as we would expect given the change in progress sweeping the English-speaking world. Diphthonginess of U, we will see shortly why this didn't really reveal anything. This is not a particularly informative result. It's been up and down, and it was clear that the change in F1 and the change in F2 were doing different things. And we're going to revisit this very shortly in order to see, well, what's going on there visually speaking. For now, a quick summary. 2 vowel phonemes are lowering a little bit and fronting. And we also have serendipitous evidence that Sointula Heritage Finnish is starting to sound more like Sointula English. And we have O monophthongizing, which is a thing that we're going to propose comes from a different reason than everything else here. So we didn't really capture the substrate in this sample of 2 speakers who are bilingual locally. But if we rely on Rankin and 2014's measurement, we see that this is what we would have expected. We would expect U and O in the Finnish to be very far back, and then for both of these to lower a little bit and move forward, given a more, at the stage where language shift has yielded to English and the local dialect of English has started catching up with this vowel fronting that's happening worldwide. So we presume for now that Sointula Finnish once looked like this, but we're going to have to do a little bit more work to reconstruct that. For now, here's a closer look, visually speaking, at our vowel trajectories. So what we've done here is taken the 25%, 50%, and 75% formant measurements and collapsed it by generation and put them all on the same graph. So we've got, this is what U is looking like in the oral history interviews. We've got U in the older speakers we interviewed in English in 2018, and U in the younger speakers interviewed in English in 2018. And then all of the same for O. The oral history interviews, the older speakers interviewed in person recently, and the younger speakers interviewed in person recently. So if we eyeball it at first, it does look as if, yeah, we've got a story of U lowering and fronting and, excuse me, O lowering and fronting as well. There's an interesting extra wrinkle here, and it's going to tell us why Euclidean distance was not particularly helpful. That the shape of these vowels, the trajectory in these 2 dimensions has changed radically. These points are not in the order that they look to be at first glance for the older generations. In the older 2 generations, U is shaped like a hairpin. Not in the younger generation. That's much more linear, much more Englishy. Exactly the same is true of O. These are hairpin shaped in the older speakers and the oral history interviews, and then much shorter, so much more monophthongal, and also a lot flatter in the youngest speakers. So what this means is that for everyone born before 1979 in our data, the Euclidean distance is not informative, and it's because the vowels aren't linearly shaped enough to give us a sense of how to infer the 50% point in either dimension from the outer 2. So the Euclidean distance measures that we showed you earlier were based on the outer 2 points in these very sharp turns. So what this tells us is we should consider sampling each vowel along more points. Okay, so the vowels have unbent themselves. We see change in real and apparent time in terms of the shapes of the vowels. We need to do a little bit more work there to investigate whether this is something characteristically Finnish. It's easy to say we anticipate that, but we'll need to get more resolution for those curves and look into it further. But we have U and O fronting. Even Tessa Muldoon, who's U and O are quite far ahead, seems to be a little bit behind Victoria with respect to how far. When Becky Roeder and Skye Onison and Alex Darcy's work, she's not quite as far as her urban counterparts, even though she lives in Victoria, likes the place, and has been there for a decade. So maybe some signs that she has rural origins with a Finnish substrate. It's also not about catching up with urban areas. It's not entirely about that, because the monophthongization of O might reflect the idea that rural norms are having some effect here. This is something that Lauren Bigelow has studied with respect to Ontario English. So in rural Northern Ontario, monophthongal O does a lot of social work, a lot of identity marking, and whereas people in urban Ontario don't seem to have any sensitivity to that. If this is pan-Canadian, this could be a marker of rurality. So we have identity work coming after a delay when it comes to context situations, just as we would expect from Trudgill and Kurzweil and so on. So promising results. On to forced alignment. We've got that working and ready to go. So that's immediately ahead. More broadly, we'll need to keep looking for substrate influences on English and Sointula across levels of the grammar. More Finnish speakers to find out, okay, what was that substrate? How do we model it best, etc. Comparisons with Mirva's fieldwork on other Finnish settled towns around the same time, like Oulu in Wisconsin, a really interesting parallel. And disentangling the effect of the rural BC baseline, excuse me, the rural BC baseline from the Finnish substrate effects. Lots more we can talk about. Okay. Thanks so much to all of these people and for all of you for coming along.
All right, thank you for that. We have 8 minutes for questions. I know I have a few questions if others are formulating their own, but I'll give a second. I see applause coming in the chat as well. I see some raised hands, so I'm going to find this. Here we go. And Rachel, you have the floor. And you are muted.
There we go. Sorry about that. Thank you so much for an interesting talk. I was struck by the comment at the beginning about Finnish inflection, which I feel speakers often use to talk about prosodic and intonational differences. I'm wondering if you're thinking about looking at those as sort of your other things to look for substrate influence.
Yeah, this is something, thanks for the question, absolutely. I'm not, Mirva's a Finnish speaker, I'm not a Finnish speaker. My only contact with Finnish had been a friend of mine who studied abroad in Finland as an undergrad. And even from his use of L2 Finnish, that was immediately what I was reminded of listening to these oral history interviews. The prosodic, the intonation, it seemed very, very Finnish. And so this is something I'm really eager to dive into. I have no background whatsoever in analyzing prosody, but it's something I think we would be missing if we didn't look at it. Yeah, there are a lot of reports that there's sort of a lilt to people who speak English in this community. I don't know what, I mean, it's metalinguistic, and I don't know what lilt means, but I think intonation is probably a big part of it. So yeah, so absolutely. Thanks so much.
Thank you for that. We have another 6 minutes left for questions while people are formulating theirs. I will say that I'd love to talk with you more about this and specifically other approaches than Euclidean distance.
That would be great.
I've been digging into similar problems. And so my dissertation, for instance, I was looking at monophthongization versus diphthonginess, but in a slightly different vowel. So I'll send you an email after this. We still have 6 minutes for other questions, and I see that we have 66 attendees, so I'm sure there are questions out there. I see one from Sally. So you should be allowed to speak anyway. You have the floor.
Okay, really great job, both of you. And I'm really want to have a shout out to you for going all the way up there and doing field work. I wondered if you could tell us a little more, Minerva, how do these people sound in Finnish? Do they sound English?
Yeah, that's a great question. It depended a bit on their generation. The younger speakers who were very much heritage speakers of Finnish, their Finnish sounded a bit more, there's clearly some English influence there. I interviewed a handful of folks who immigrated from Finland as teenagers or young adults, and their Finnish still sounded very Finnish, if that makes sense. I think they're mostly Southern dialects, if I recall correctly. So their Finnish hadn't changed very much, but it was very clearly a distinctive difference in the heritage speakers.
Yeah, Finnish is such a great language to listen to because it's so different to the English ear. So I think it's a great opportunity. And Marisa, next time you guys present some work, it would be lovely for the audience to actually hear that lilt, whatever it is, because this is a unique situation and it would be great to get a sense of what's going on there.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, we discussed it. I cut 8 or 9 different samples out of the audio as possibilities. But especially once we had the vowel graphs ready and there was more to talk about than we expected, it was already a little bit over time. And I also have to double check exactly what I agreed to when I purchased copies of all these things from the BC Museum and Archives. They're on the public record, but ethically, I wasn't entirely sure whether presenting them, especially in a recorded situation, I wasn't sure whether I had permission to do that. So that's something I need to follow up on. All this was completed before everything moved on to Zoom, and it makes it a little more complicated.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Wonderful study. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have, I think, time for at least one more question. There's one in the Q&A, which was, have you considered coding speaker generation as well in your analysis? They elaborate, I know Trudgill 2004 mentions how in these tabula rasa situations, second generation often show substrate features, while these features often dissipate by the third. If the third generation does show substrate effects, then that could be really interesting. It's from Chad Hall.
Oh yeah, hi Chad. Yeah, we talked a little bit about this 3-generation model. It's a little tricky. It's easy to cluster the speakers according to where the breaks are in our data. It's not clear exactly. It's not clear if those are logical generational breaks in terms of the history of the community. The speakers born in 1905 and 1922, that's a big gap, but they all sound very similar. And so it would come down to where do we draw the line here, and does it reflect the natural history? Because it seems to have been sort of a continuous process of, in a small community, it's hard to know exactly where to draw the line, but it's something that's been on my mind, because for a while I was labeling everyone with generational numbers, and then they kept getting out of sync with each other, and I eventually abandoned the whole thing. But I think it's important to keep in mind as a background, just because it's sort of fading into each other doesn't mean that there isn't sort of a locus of each one.
I'd love to see where they fit in a tree, right, as far as relationships or a network.
Oh yeah, a lot of them are closely related. Katri Rijksman was the great-grandmother of about 5 of the people I interviewed.
Interesting. All right, well, I think we are just at time for the next talk. So thank you very much for that. It was fascinating.
Thanks everyone, much appreciated.
Thank you.
So our next talk is from Kelly Wright at University of Michigan. It is Linguistic Inequities, an audit study of 3 American dialects in the housing market. And you have the floor.
Thank you, Taylor. All right. Thank you all. I am coming to you today as a representative of the University of Michigan, which is seated on the traditional and unceded territories of the 3 Fires people, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. I will be beginning this talk with a positionality statement because I feel like they are one of the first steps we can take to create equity in our field. So, hello, I am a biracial Black cis woman from Appalachia. I'm a fourth year PhD candidate. I am working class, chaotic neutral. I am a second generation student in that I mean my father was an integrator, the first African-American student to attend the Catholic school we both went to. And I have committed myself and my work to the full-scale decolonization of linguistics as a discipline. This work is on linguistic profiling, which is a phenomenon that operates similarly to racial profiling in that it operates with informal, on-the-spot, and largely non-conscious speech judgments, which are then linked to social stereotypes. This phenomenon was first defined by a landmark study from Purnell, Itzardi, and Baugh in 1999, who observed that discrimination according to race is illegal under the Fair Housing Act, but that race is reflected in speech. And so they designed an experiment to test if social discrimination was possible through speech in the housing market and found very convincing evidence that this is true. Purnell et al. Were working in the Bay Area, but subsequent work shows us that this phenomenon is not confined to that city. Massey and Lundy did an audit study showing that this happens across 20 cities. Several years later, Hansen and Hawley did this over email, so linguistic profiling extends to writing. And Forrest and Dong did this with Chinese language advertisements, so it also operates cross-linguistically. I am interested in how local prestige effects interface with the linguistic profiling phenomenon. Local prestige defined by Peter Trudgill in his Norwich study, he observed that working class men in public said that their speech was horrible, but in private really celebrated it. So there was something special going on there. And Fuertes et al. Take this one step further, calling it covert prestige and looking at how it operates internally. When we're first listening to someone, if we notice something in them that might be non-standard out in the world, but to us sounds more like home, we can upgrade them essentially in character traits. So I did an adapted audit study following Massey and Lundy's format. And I used a pre-planned call protocol, which means everyone got the same questions, a pre-planned target population, which I'll describe in a moment, and used a between participants design. So each listener heard only one voice. I did the study in Knoxville, which is my hometown, and I delineated 3 neighborhoods of interest by racial and socioeconomic demographics. I'm looking at a white working class neighborhood, a middle class neighborhood, and a Black working class neighborhood. Sorry, I skipped a slide. Okay. Here, I speak 3 native dialects. They are African American, Standard American or mainstream US English, and Southern American. I'm going to play these examples for you.
Hello, I am calling about a house I saw for rent on Craigslist. Hello, I am calling about a house I saw for rent on Craigslist. Hi there, I am calling about a house I saw for rent on Craigslist.
All right. So these are actually clips from actual calls in the audit study, and they were normed for race and region. This is a graphic representation of the calls that I made. So it shows that there are 30 calls placed in each neighborhood and 30 in each voice. The call protocol I developed, I used on Google Forms. I mention this only because it's a very highly replicable approach. So someone could take the form that I developed and try this study in another city, and I hope that someone will. And it provides really reliable storage. So when you're taking notes live, they go straight into your storage. After piloting, it was determined that Craigslist was the best search engine to use because the people who are posting advertisements on Craigslist have a more individual stake. They might own the homes themselves or also live in the neighborhood instead of being employed by a larger organization that has, set interaction directions for their employees. So in every session, I used only one voice. So I wasn't switching in between my voices each call. I would sit down, do a search for an apartment with 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, and then use a random number generator to choose which listing to call during the session. I am not today going to be talking to you about the qualitative work I did on the call protocol results, but just so you have an idea of the questions that were asked, I asked folks questions about amenities, finances, the area, its safety, and my personal fit for the property. What I am going to talk to you about today is commitment level. This is the measure that I have developed for looking at linguistic profiling in the contemporary marketplace. When Purnell et al. Did their study in the 90s, the housing market was not nearly as robust online as it is today. The idea that you could get an outright no from a landlord was much more common than now, when we have many other options for engaging with properties without having to walk to them physically. And so commitment level is my way of capturing this phenomenon without having to rely on a yes-no dichotomy. So a high commitment level is one where the caller gets a high level of engagement from the landlord and a high level of access. So going in descending order, a traditional appointment is one where the manager and the caller choose a day and time to meet, where the understanding is that they too will be the parties involved in the appointment. An online appointment is where a caller is provided with a schedule and chooses a day and time that fits, that makes sense for them, but they may not meet with that manager. They might just meet with any available employee. Office hours we're open from 9 to 5, come in anytime. A later appointment is where the caller is instructed to call back to make a traditional appointment. NA is when you are told the property is not available. No is an explicit no. There's also one other. These appointments involve submitting your credentials online and then being given private access to a space. So before we go forward to look at some of these results, I just want to be clear that I cannot claim that every manager had a choice between all levels of commitment for each call. If you have an extra property that you're renting out on Craigslist, you perhaps don't have office hours, right? But it is assumed that a traditional appointment is always available, as is the right of refusal. So my predictions are looking at this interaction between commitment level and local prestige effects. Do we see higher commitment in situations where we are expecting voices to be experiencing local prestige? And so the Southern voice is expected to have its highest prestige in the white working class area, the Muse voice in the middle class area, and the AAL voice in the Black working class area. So looking here at the raw data, this is just counts of appointment types. In the middle block here, circled, we see an even number of results for all 3 voices in the middle class neighborhood. That is expected because the middle class neighborhood is much more demographically heterogeneous than the other spaces, and therefore local prestige effects will be reduced. But when we move down to looking at the blue bar here in the white working class neighborhood, we see that the Southern voice is receiving a lot more traditional appointments than the other voices. This is exactly what we would expect in this condition if local prestige was having an effect. And if we move over to the other side of this box, looking at the tall red bar here, we see that the African-American voice is getting many more later appointments than the other 2. This is also what we would expect because the AAL voice should be experiencing its lowest level of prestige in the white working class neighborhood. So that's raw data, but I wanted to run a predictive model. I used the FIT model in R to ask, given these conditions, a given voice in a given neighborhood, what is the likelihood that an appointment will fall above a given commitment level? And for this analysis, I removed that one other appointment and the NA appointments because in the NA conditions, I didn't actually ask for an appointment. Okay, so here is my model. When we look on the right, this is the African-American voice in the Black working class neighborhood. That thick green bar at the top shows us that it is indeed experiencing local prestige effects, receiving more traditional appointments than the other voices. When we move to the other side of the screen here, we see the Southern voice in the white working class neighborhood is getting many more traditional appointments than the other 2 voices. So when both of these voices in these conditions are experiencing local prestige, why is it not even, right? Why is the Southern voice experiencing more prestige than the AAL voice? So to answer that question, I ran an ordinal logistic regression model using voice and neighborhood as fixed effects. This model reports odds ratios, so how likely is it that something will occur? Because I have a 3x3 comparison, 3 voices and 3 neighborhoods, it necessitated several rotations of this model. I'm happy to share that raw data with you if you want to email me and ask. But today I've made a summary table for us to work off of. So in the top line here, we see AAL and Black working class compared to Southern and white working class. These are these 2 prestige conditions we're interested in. So zooming in here, that OR value, that's that ordinal regression value, the odds ratio, we see that the Southern voice in the white working class neighborhood is 25 times more likely to move up 1 order of commitment relative to the use of AAL in the Black working class neighborhood. So this starts to explain that difference in those green bars, why the Southern had much more, right? And so this ordinal logistic regression is consistent with the raw data and the predictive modeling. And looking at these results, I argue that the Southern voice enjoys a more robust effect than AAL because the variety is indexed to whiteness, which of course carries its own privileges. So thinking about these results in terms of local prestige, taking Chardill's approach, the Southern voice in the white working class neighborhood results make sense. This was Knoxville, and I'm a Knoxvillian, right? My Southern dialect is much more local sounding than perhaps the other 2. We expect local prestige to be happening all throughout the East Tennessee area, especially since the Southern variety is more standard and more common variety of Knoxville. But thinking about Baugh's approach in this 2003 work on linguistic profiling, we really should see a more robust effect for AAL in the Black working class neighborhood like Purnell et al. Found in Woodside. So I have 2 theories as to why that didn't occur. Before I describe this, let me quickly say that I don't know for sure what the race of these listeners is, right? These people were, I called publicly listed numbers. They didn't know they were part of science, right? But I did, however, make note of my percepts of their voices if you'd like to ask questions about that. And so my ideas are perhaps it is the face of the market. Black people are statistically underrepresented in the housing market as owners. That is as true in Knoxville as it is in other cities. And so I'm not getting as many Black people on the other end of the line, and even fewer in the conditions where local prestige is expected. So it's possible that a subsequent experiment that was targeted for these populations, we might find a more robust prestige effect that we expect. It is also possible that stereotype threat is operating here, right? I may be reaching other Black people on the line, but them hearing Blackness in my voice actually creates a negative assessment of my qualities instead of a positive assessment of my qualities because of how stereotype threat operates, right? I am unsure. Future research will have to tease this out, and I encourage someone to go do it. So the one thing I want to leave you with, the point I would like to hammer home is that I found evidence of steering in this experiment. Steering is a direct violation of the Fair Housing Act. It occurs when a potential tenant inquires about property A, but the manager shows them or steers them towards property B. So I have 2 examples to share with you today that occurred in contexts where we would expect a voice to be experiencing low prestige effects. The first, this is the Southern voice. I called about a home in the Black working class neighborhood. The manager gave me a detail or 2 and then spent several minutes telling me about another property, which is in Lenoir City. Lenoir City is about 30 minutes outside of downtown Knoxville, so 30 minutes away from this property I was calling about, and is almost exclusively white working class. The manager goes on to say, quote, "I'm not real familiar with the area. I live on the other side, on the west side. I don't know much about how it is day to day. On the weekend, it can get a little more full and more things going on. Corner lot and no stop sign in this direction, and it's on a Y and people zip through. I lowered the price to compensate. It's shady. It isn't city," right? So this is a pretty blatant example of steering, along with the dog whistles and everything else. this example is the AAL voice calling about a property in the white working class neighborhood. And this is almost the entire call, right? The manager, after hearing which property I was inquiring about, stated, "Oh, I have another house available. It's more, $895 a month. It's in 37914. It's in East Knoxville," which is smack dab in the center of the Black working class neighborhood. And before I could ask this manager any questions, they suggested that I call back in a week and see what I have. So they immediately downgraded me in commitment and shifted me to a later appointment. And so this is another example of steering. And so what I want to make clear is that perceived low prestige can translate into oppression of non-standard speakers. So the takeaways I'd like to leave you with is that local prestige affects our complex, right? It really should be a discipline in itself, understanding them. And I am excited to see where work goes from here. And that discrimination on the basis of voice is happening. It is happening right now. It is happening all over the world, right? And it's not just in housing. And that all linguists can and should advocate for policy changes which reflect this fact. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
All right, thank you, Kelly, for that. That was very, very interesting. I would encourage you to take a moment after this to go back through the chat because you have a lot of robust discussion happening. So I encourage you to look at that. I see some hands raised and there's a question in the Q&A. So let me start with the Q&A question from an anonymous attendee. What do you make of the comparably low commitment levels for Muse, for mainstream US English?
Low levels in which condition?
Unfortunately, they
I'm sure.
there's an obvious question in there, so I will let them perhaps follow up in the Q&A, and we're going to pass to, I see a number of people with their hands up. We're going to pass to Gregory Guy.
Hello, this was fantastic. It's a great demonstration of white linguistic privilege. I would like just to say, I hope you get this published as soon as possible so I can assign it to my students.
Thank you.
I see a hand up from Jesse Grieser, so you have the floor now. Let me try that again. You have the floor now.
There we go. I think I'm off mute this time. Kelly, fantastic work, and you know I love this work. You know I'm already assigning it because if you bother her a little bit, she does have some write-ups of this that you can squeeze out of her. It turns out. I have a question about the association of the Southern guys with whiteness, and as a local, I'm wondering how far these properties are from my house. In fact. My impression is very much that the idea, especially of the Knoxvillian accent, and especially an educated Knoxvillian accent, which you definitely have, is of whiteness. Like there's the person on the other end is probably not being imagined. And so I'm wondering to what extent that was normed, and if you can address some of those issues.
Thank you. Yeah, I've got a slide for this. I'm going to share that. Can you all see this? So they were normed. Those 3 samples that you all heard were played for 60 folks on MTurk. And these are the racial percepts that we have for that voice. So we can see the Muse voice is 95% raced as white, the Southern voice 92.5, and the AAL voice 62.5. So it's pretty clearly normed for whiteness. I also asked these folks questions about 10 attributes. And so the attribute assessment also seems to suggest that the Southern voice is enjoying white privilege because it forms a 3-way dichotomy with the other voices, with Muse being the most prestigious, Southern in the middle, and AAL at the bottom. But Muse and Southern are essentially the same on a number of characteristics. It is only education, confidence. Let me see if I have that slide actually before I just run through here.
Go into the bonus levels. Excellent.
I know. Just kidding. I don't have it. But it is on 4 percepts, it is essentially the same as whiteness. So it is the things that you would think, education, confidence, for the Southern voice.
I see a question in the Q&A from Mark Vizona, and you can correct me on the pronunciation. It says, absolutely stellar talk, and thank you for the detailed methods and offer to share the Google form information. Do you think that different landlords also steered in response to the gender of voices from different varieties? And were there any differences according to landlords' gender identities in their responses?
That's a great question. Maybe. I mean, I am certainly female sounding to most folks, and you know, it's my voice in all of these conditions. So it's possible that gender had an effect in some of the qualitative work. Like, there are a couple people who said, like, when I asked that fit question is a great question. Thanks, Will Styler, for that, because it kind of takes people off guard, and then they have this opportunity to sort of reflect on what I've said. And so a lot of times in that fit question, people would be like, I love renting to single women because they're clean, which is hilarious if anyone has ever seen my room. Yeah, so a lot of people were definitely thinking about my gender, at least as part of some of the things that they said. I also had a couple people like, oh, maybe you can come to our church. Like, there's a great group for women and all this other stuff. So it definitely had something to do with how they were thinking about me, but I don't know if it had, I can't say if it had effects on the rating. I honestly can't say if the standardness of my voice had effects on the appointments that they gave me. It's just a measure of the appointments I received.
I see a hand up from Jamal Mwakil, so you are allowed to talk. I realize I've never said your last name out loud, so feel free to correct.
It's all good. I appreciate it, Taylor. It's Mwakil, but you mostly had it. You got it. Thank you, Kelly, for your talk. I think it's really important. I think that as an initial comment, that you've done a very deft job of utilizing your unique linguistic skills, well, your linguistics training through your skills and methodologies alongside the unique affordances of your positionality and your lived experience. So I think that you're modeling, I think, the future of what it means to be an actively engaged linguist. And so I hope that the model of your intellectual trajectory is duplicated in the near future. I wanted to ask you about that reality and how you've deployed it to address this specific question. What words of encouragement would you give to linguists who are looking to explicitly, positively impact their community and policy through their scholarship? Any tips from your journey so far?
Oh, thank you, Jamal. What a wonderful question. So this work was very hard. Emotionally, personally, right? When I got into it and started making these calls, I realized that, especially when I was using the AAL voice, that I was actually scheduling time to allow myself to be discriminated against. Like, it was in my schedule. I found myself kind of dreading those sessions and ended up moving some of those things around. And so doing work that it does reflect your positionality, that seats you in the work, is very important. It's very much how I think that we need to be moving forward. I think that people need to be taking personal investment in their work. But it was very challenging. And so what I would say is, and this is advice I got from John Rickford, get into therapy. I couldn't have done this work if I didn't have a very robust research community. The Black linguist community really has held me up and had a space to just share what these experiences are like with someone who understands it. I can't stress that enough, that, and to leave yourself enough time to feel it, right? Because it's about you, it's about your voice, it's about your speech community, it's about people who you love who are being oppressed. To leave space to feel that, and to hopefully in publication create space to reflect that as well.
We have a question from Isaac Bleeman. I think you can unmute yourself as you're a panelist.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for a really interesting talk. Could you speak a little bit more about the social implications of the methodology? Beyond how they might react to the findings about bias, is it possible that the participants might feel that you wasted their time or their money in terms of salary or commissions by their participating in the study?
Great question. Yeah, so I had a pretty detailed schedule. I would make appointments that I would ask for appointments that were a couple weeks out, letting them know that I had never been to the area before, and just wanted information. That's part of the reason why I had so many questions. And the next day or the next session, I call the person. I start my session essentially by calling the people I had talked to before, and either leaving them a message or telling them that I had found another place, and that I wouldn't be keeping the appointment. So nobody was sitting at a house waiting for me to show up, even though I was like states away. I realized that there is still some ethical squishiness about moving people or taking people's time in this way when I never actually intended to rent an apartment from them. I will say that I've done parts of this work at 2 different organizations, and their IRBs felt very differently about that exact point. But what was ultimately determined was these were publicly listed numbers, and this is part of their job. This is what they do when they put their information out there. And so therefore they probably do expect some people to not show up or not pan out after having conversations with them. So overall, I feel fine with it, but it is definitely something to keep in mind.
We have a question here from John Baugh. I'm unmuting, and you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Kelly. Absolutely fantastic work. And you're right. Way back when we started this, Craigslist was not a place you could rent anything. So moving in that direction is helpful. Your commitment index is a huge and important advance with legal and policy implications. Greg is right. Publish this. Law schools need it. But my question goes to the Massey and Lundy breakthrough. Did you run into any instances where people were using answering machines to screen the calls? Because what we know now is a lot of this discrimination results in people calling, they get an answering machine, they never get a call back, and that's harder to prove in court.
Absolutely. That's such an excellent question. I, somewhere deep in an Excel sheet, I have a list of all the numbers that I called that essentially went straight to voicemail or I went to voicemail. I didn't leave messages. That was something that, we toyed with in the beginning, what I craft answering machine messages, and I didn't do that. It would be something that somebody could absolutely test. It would be really interesting. The only thing that I have is numbers of people who never picked up the phone. And it did make it hard sometimes, like, okay, there's only 3 properties available in this neighborhood today and nobody wants to take my call. So I've got to move on to something else and come back. Jesse knows about that because I was like, can you help me find people at one point? But yeah, no, I don't know of a better way than counting them to get that information.
Since we have 1 more minute left, I'd like to ask you a quick question, maybe about a future direction. So you talked about the possibility of covert prestige with AAL, and you also talked about the possibility of AAL speakers, having negative linguistic ideologies about AAL. That's something that I know I've run into in some of my past research. So looking at court reporters, there were people who clearly spoke it, but also clearly had very strong linguistic ideologies about the language variety. And I don't have, specific methodology in mind right now, but I'm wondering if you're thinking about following up looking at that more particularly, because I know in other fields there's a lot of discussion of homophily, right? So like birds of a feather flock together, and there's this expectation that you would see a preference for AAL voices in Black neighborhoods. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that you could expand on.
Yeah, no, great question. I would love to see this work replicated in other cities, especially cities with a larger Black population than Knoxville, Tennessee. The reason why I chose Knoxville is because, like I said, I told these people that I'd never been to the city, and I wanted to know if they were being honest with me.
Student in Michigan, she's going to get a job.
Some of those instances, I've got notes about how they absolutely were not honest with me, right? Telling me things about neighborhoods that simply weren't true. And so the forward direction is to like hopefully get people, other people who are multi-dialectal or groups of people to call in other places and just see what a differently demographic what different demographics will do to these kinds of results. As far as my own next steps, my dissertation is actually working in a different direction. I'm doing experimental research on perceptions of Black professional speech, but that work also involves a series of sociolinguistic interviews, and part of what I'm asking in these interviews are exactly these questions about how do you feel about your own language? How do you feel about it for others? How do you feel about it when people use, AAL versus Black accented standard in a professional space? And, what did your grandparents tell you about, speaking this way and things like that? And they're very rich and wonderful, and I'm enjoying learning from that community. So stay tuned.
All right, we'll talk more about this later because I have to follow up with you on some of that. All right, so we are now at our last talk of the session. This is Phonetic Contrast in Unterland Yiddish Vowels from Chaya Nove at the Graduate Center at CUNY. And you have the floor. Thank you again, Kelly, for a wonderful talk.
Okay, give me just a second. Okay, so thank you, Taylor, Shinem Dank, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I did not think this was possible, but you have completely distracted me from my work, and I don't even know what I'm talking about. This has been just so much fun and so wonderful. So let's think. So this is Phonetic Contrast in Unterland Yiddish Vowels with a subtitle, A First Look. Okay. So I'll start with a brief overview of the study. The language investigated here is Interland Yiddish. The goal was to establish the phonetic correlates of the length contrast. I just need to move this. Of the length contrast in these long short vowels E, U, and A. And to that end, I conducted an acoustic analysis of vowels as produced by 13 speakers born and raised in the Interland region of Eastern Europe. The hypothesis going in was that the dominant acoustic cue for distinguishing between the long and short vowels in each pair would be relative duration, and that they would be qualitatively more similar. This hypothesis was based on an analysis of vowels that produced by descendants of the Interland Yiddish speakers, which shows a fair amount of qualitative overlap in all the vowel pairs among the children of the Interland Yiddish speakers in New York, with a progressive divergence of long, short, high vowels in apparent time. So I want to note again that this is a first look at the data, which I've only recently processed. So I used newly developed tools for measuring vowel formants, which I will talk about later. And that really slowed the processing down significantly, but hopefully it was all worth it. And so I'm happy to hear people's input on what's going on. And so this is just like a preliminary look. So let's start with the big questions. What is Interland Yiddish and why should we care about it? So the terms Oberland and Interland, so in my dialect, which derives from the Interlect dialect, it's pronounced Interland, due to a historical merger of E and U. And these are terms used by Yiddish speakers they were terms used by Yiddish speakers living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire to refer to a culturally relevant East-West division. And here's how the region is delineated by two scholars who examined the dialects spoken here. And I will just let you look at that. Okay, so for a more visual description, you can see the region on this map highlighted approximately in the pink. So the region is interesting, broadly speaking, for the following reasons, all of which can have linguistic implications. So first of all, Yiddish speakers settled in the Interland region relatively recently compared to other Eastern European regions. The Jewish people only migrated there in large numbers in the 19th century. Migration occurred from three directions: from the west, from Germany and the Czech lands, from the north, from over the Carpathians, from Galicia, which is in modern day Poland, and from the east, which is modern day Moldova and Ukraine. All these three regions represent three of the four main Yiddish dialects: Western Yiddish, Central Yiddish, and Southeastern Yiddish, which means that there was a lot of dialect mixing in the communities as well as in individual households. Initially part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Jews in this region had developed a very strong Hungarian identity. And then in 1918 and 19, the northern swath of the region was annexed to Czechoslovakia, and then the eastern portion was claimed by Romania. And the speakers whose speech I'm going to be analyzing in the study were all born during that period of transition. So for all of them, Hungarian remained a very important secondary or even sometimes primary language, but now they were also being instructed in Czech or Romanian or Ukrainian in school. Geographically, the Carpathian Mountains form some sort of a natural boundary to the north and the east, and this relative isolation from actually very adjacent lands potentially enabled a new interland dialect to form, influenced by these different Yiddish dialects and by these different contact languages. This area has also received only scant attention from Yiddish linguists. And finally, and most importantly to me, the vast majority of today's Yiddish speakers, Hasidic Jews, largely trace their ancestry to this region. And since I spend most of my time analyzing Hasidic Yiddish, it's really important for me to know where it comes from and what it looked like prior to its contact with English. So what do we know about Interland Yiddish? Most of what we know is based on Uriel Weinreich's preliminary 1964 study, based on data from the Language and Culture Atlas of Ashkenazic Jewry. We know that overwhelmingly it does pattern like Central Yiddish, but it also displays a lot of variability and contains many elements of Western Yiddish as well. Like Central Yiddish, Interland Yiddish preserved the feature length in U, I, and A. Some examples are Zin and Zin, Hand and Hand, and Struf and Schlof, which is a conditioned split based on the following consonant. So we know that cross-linguistically, such contrasts are sometimes realized by differences in vowel duration, differences in vowel spectrum, a combination of duration and spectrum, in addition to other potential acoustic cues. So what do we know about the phonetic aspects of the length contrast in Central Yiddish? Again, not much. Weinreich 1963 asserts that long vowels are monophthongs as opposed to diphthongs. Birnbaum 1979 transcribes short E and U as lax vowels. However, Weinreich 1964 in his study on the Interland region notes that there's a maximally high quality to the short E, and he transcribes the word geniemen as geniemen. If I can play the sound, which is of an Interland Yiddish speaker saying the word Schiff, which is the word for ship in Yiddish, and it has a short E, you could hear it in the way I say it. Maybe you'll be able to judge for yourself. So this is a European speaker.
Sheep. Sheep.
Okay. So here I want to shift gears for a moment to talk very briefly about a study that I conducted on vowels produced by New York Hasidic Yiddish speakers of 3 generations. The data come from word lists. 24 speakers are represented here. And this is a vowel plot with mean F1, F2 vowel values plotted by generation. And we see what appears to be a divergence in the E pair in apparent time between generations 2 and 3 and 4, specifically some lowering and centering of the short I. And in the U pair too, the short vowels seem to be gradually lowering and centralizing. And here is a generation 4 speaker saying the same word, shift. So, okay. Ooh, okay. So to test this, oh, what? Yeah, okay. So to test this in the New York speakers, I calculated Euclidean distance of each vowel token from a bi-speaker long vowel mean, and I fitted mixed effects models for each vowel pair separately for vowel quality using the Euclidean distance measures and separately for vowel duration. The model showed a significant difference in Euclidean distance between generations 3 and 4 in the high vowels, but no significant difference across generations for the A pair. Additionally, while duration was significant in all generations, there was a statistically significant diminishing difference in duration in all vowel pairs between generations 3 and 4, meaning that the difference between them was shrinking, suggesting that as Q weighting was shifting towards vowel spectrum, possibly, duration becomes less important. Now, given this change in apparent time, and considering that English, the contact language for Hasidic Yiddish in New York, has this tense lax distinction in the high vowels, I wondered about the baseline for these vowels. What did they look like prior to their contact with English? Which leads me to the present study, which addresses the question, what are the main phonetic differences between long and short correlates of the vowels E, U, and A? Do they differ in duration? Do they differ in intenseness? The data for this study were drawn from the USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive. This institute, which was founded by Steven Spielberg and is housed at the University of Southern California, has been interviewing survivors of the Holocaust and of other genocides all around the world in all languages since 1993. The video recorded testimonies average 2 hours in length, and they include personal history before, during, and after the war. The archive contains more than 51,000 Holocaust testimonies, of which less than 600 are in Yiddish. Each testimony is indexed using numerous categories, including names and geographical locations and dates. And so using these various search features on the website, which is amazing, I identified approximately 50 Yiddish testimonies of survivors raised in the Interland region. Of these, I selected 6 male and 6 female speakers for the present analysis. And also included in this study is data from an interview that I recently conducted with a 92-year-old female speaker from the region. So I focused on speakers from the cities or towns that are most typically associated with today's Hasidim, which falls in the more narrow region of the Unterland defined by Weinreich. And here's a table with some basic demographic information about the speakers. Here, new language refers to the language that the speaker acquired or presumably acquired in the second diaspora, meaning in their new homeland after the war. And this is to look for possible change over the lifespan, like does this new contact change anything? Because the speakers were interviewed about 50 years after they had left their homeland. So we have to take that into account. Okay, so here's a quick visual of some of the speakers roughly arranged according to the locations of their homelands on the map. And so for methods, the first hour of each interview was transcribed using the LAN. Unique words were extracted. The pronunciation was mapped using a modified alphabet system. The words were also coded for language if it was like bilingual speakers code switching. Then the Montreal Forced Aligner was trained on over 65 hours of Yiddish audio and aligned. In Prat, I looked for the optimal tracking range for each speaker for the 2 vowel formants. I could talk more about this if anybody's interested. To track the vowel formants, this is where new tools comes in. I used Fast Track, which is a brand new Prat plugin developed by Santiago Barreto of UC Davis, whom I thank for his responsiveness while I was working on this. I think less than a handful. I was among the first beta testers of this, and it took a lot of time to figure out the best practices for using this. Hopefully it will have been worth it. The fast track measures, so what fast track does is it measures the formants of each vowel a designated number of times called steps using a range of high, low, max frequencies, and then uses regression to select the smoothest line. So there's hopefully a better chance that it grabs the formant measures more correctly rather than just relying on a script that like grabs one measure in the midpoint. All the stressed vowels were extracted, the duration was measured, first and second formants were tracked using ranges that reflect the optimal range that I identified for each speaker. And then I used 24 steps, which is the maximum number, to find the best formants. Using the images generated by Fast Track, I then spot checked the output to ensure that vowels were tracking well. I made tons of adjustments. I must have run it 100 times until I got it right. And then I removed all non-Yiddish words, plotted all the function words, and identified the ones that were most reduced and that had the least success for formant tracking. So the categories that proved most reduced were articles and pronouns. So I systematically reduced them. I also eliminated, so I took a very conservative approach with eliminating words. I didn't want to take anything out unless I had to. I eliminated some high frequency conjunction, prepositions, and auxiliaries. And then I calculated Mahalanobis distance by vowel and speaker using the iterative method implemented in the Joey R package by Joey Stanley, removed the highest 5%. The formant values were normalized using Leboeuf's modification of Neria described in the Atlas of North American English. And finally, I calculated Euclidean distance of each vowel from a by-speaker mean of the long vowel in each pair. So a total of 19,895 tokens were analyzed. The table shows here shows the distribution of tokens by vowel class. Let's look at some of the results, starting with vowel duration. We don't really need like statistics, I think, to recognize that these vowel pairs are clearly distinct in their duration, but I'll report on the statistics in a moment. Turning now to vowel quality. And here I want to encourage those of you who are interested in looking at the data more closely to go to my Shiny app website by scanning the QR code or clicking on the link. I was going to present it from the website because it's much prettier than my slides, but I chickened out the last minute. I got nervous, but they're nicer than my slides, and you can explore the data in a more interactive and sustained way. So then I created the conventional vowel plots for visualization. Looking at the vowel plot on the left, we can see total overlap of the long and short ah, not surprisingly, and a fair amount of overlap in the high vowels, with the means of the short vowels falling within the confidence intervals of the long ones. For comparison, on the right, there's a similar plot of vowel tokens from the wordless data of generations 2, 3, and 4 from my New York Yiddish speakers. So there's definitely some change going on. I then fitted regression models for each vowel pair with Euclidean distance as the dependent variable and vowel log duration and preceding and following segment coded for voice, place, and manner, as well as interaction of vowel by log duration as fixed effects. I added new language as a fixed effect to check whether language contact in the new diaspora might be a predictor. I did this because in examining the data, I noted some inter-speaker differences in the amount of overlap in these vowels. Random intercepts were included for speaker and word. The results show a significant difference between the long short vowels in the E pair, but not in U and Ah. Duration was significant in all the pairs, so that's your statistics. Other language was not significant in any of the pairs, and some contextual features, which were not surprising. Finally, I wanted to visualize the distance between the vowels in each pair once durational and contextual effects are controlled for. So there wasn't a lot that I could do with this. So there wasn't a lot of statistical comparison that I can do by looking at just this one group. I wasn't really expecting, I had no good reason to expect that there would be differences in male-female speakers because we're not hypothesizing any necessarily any change going on. And so I was looking for what else I can do to make this a little bit more visual And so what I did was I fitted regression models for each vowel pair again, but this time I used F1 and F2 instead of Euclidean distance as dependent variables. And I then took the model predicted means, or the estimates, and I plotted the vowel tokens with the estimated instead of the normalized means in the center. So this gives us some indication of how close in phonetic space these vowels might actually be once you take all these effects of preceding and following consonants out. So what can we conclude about the phonetic contrast in these three vowel pairs in Interland Yiddish at this early point? We have a significant difference in duration between long, short vowels in each pair and a fair amount of overlap in quality. Taken together, these results suggest that length is the primary distinguishing cue, at least for U and A, possibly also for E, I would say. Some implications of this study, to my knowledge, this is the first acoustic study of European Yiddish vowels. So Isaac Bleeman in his dissertation used data from this archive to examine release bursts in stop consonants, but I don't know if anybody has done work on European vowels in this way. The study shows, I think, how the USC Showa Foundation Visual History Archive in particular, but other archives can be used to create these regionalized corpora that can serve as the basis of acoustic studies of Eastern European Yiddish dialects. And most importantly, for me and for other people who are working on contemporary Yiddish dialects, it provides this baseline for contemporary Hasidic Yiddish dialects that are spoken around the world today, which can help us understand the development of these dialects in their new linguistic and sociocultural environments. So I want to thank all of you for attending and to thank the following people and organizations for making my research possible. And I have some references, and with that, I think I will stop share.
Thank you for that excellent talk. You have a couple of questions that have already come in. First and foremost was, is there an existing Yiddish pre-trained model for MFA, or did you train your own? And I think a follow-up that I'd like to know is yours available if you trained your own?
Oh, thank you. I'm so happy to start with that question. So so Yiddish is an under-resourced language. There was nothing. I started everything from scratch. These archives have not been transcribed, so it started from transcription. I trained my own model, and I plan to make it available once it's cleaned up. So at present, my dictionary includes only the words from my corpus, but I want to build it out and make it available, to make the pronunciation dictionary available along with the acoustic model. And there are plans. So I'm in conversation with Isaac Bleeman and with the people at the USC VHA about work that we can do on the archive. And I think the possibilities are very exciting.
I see we have a good 40 plus participants here, so I'll give them time to formulate their own questions. In the meantime, I was looking at your measure of overlap and relatedness, and you may want to look into the Rosenbaum multivariate crossmatch. It's a multivariate generalization of the crossmatch test, and it's something that I've played around with vowels in the past, and it may be of use to you there for to what extent these are merged or confusable, or behaving in the same way, and to what extent they're distinguishable as their own distributions. And I see a hand up.
Thank you. I think you presented on that at one of the LSAs, right? Do I remember correctly? I remember that.
I never assumed.
I'll
so
talk to you about it.
I'll send it to you. I see a hand up from Isaac Bleeman, so I'll ask you to unmute, and you have the floor.
Hi, Chaya. Thanks for the great talk. I feel bad asking a question because we talk already. Now that you've listened to a lot of these Holocaust testimonies, I wanted to get your thoughts on the parallels between the Holocaust testimony as a genre and the sociolinguistic interview. It seems like the danger of death question is obviously always brought up. And do you think there are other parallels beyond that in terms of the genre, the style that's elicited?
So yeah, I think there are lots of parallels. Definitely what you mentioned, the danger of death. These testimonies tend, as we can expect, to get extremely emotional. People break down crying, and I think sometimes that's that moment where those linguistic features that maybe represent your speech at the time may come out. There's also the possibility that talking about things that happened in the past also might elicit some of these features, even if the speaker's speech has changed somewhat over their lifespan. It's possible that reverting, talking about your childhood may elicit some of those features. And there's some research to show that that does indeed happen. So I think that's really interesting. I think it's, the interviewers are really trained to do something that I had to learn the hard way, which is really to just like give people space to talk, and they do it so beautifully that what we get is like this, these long narratives that are free and conversational. And so, yeah, I think there are numerous parallels. There are others that I probably am not thinking of right now. Thank you for the question.
And we still have another 4 minutes. I see I see a question in the Q&A from Mark Vizonat. It is, thank you, Chaya. Did you have any information on these testimonials about the degree to which their families also spoke Yiddish at the time of the interview? Do you think that individual social networks, perhaps other survivors in the shul, also impacted different speakers?
Oh, yeah, that's such a great question. So this is a question I think about, but so the first part is something that I really think about, because I have found for the people that I've interviewed, just less than a handful of Holocaust survivors myself. And I have discovered that the linguistic profile of people is not something that I can take for granted, meaning that what they actually spoke at home and what languages were the domains of the different languages growing up is very complex. And so I when I looked at, for example, these interspeaker differences in overlap, there were some speakers who were just like completely overlapped. I actually plotted them separately. And when I plotted them separately, it's like, and there was no, so there was no obvious social factors that jumped out at me. So it wasn't like new language acquired. It wasn't like a gender thing. It wasn't necessarily a regional thing. And what I was thinking is that my intuition would be that the primary language that they spoke growing up may have a lot to do with it. So going back to Isaac's question, one of the challenges of using archival data instead of interviewing people myself is that I'm not in control of the questions. So there are things I want to know, but that I don't necessarily get to hear the answers to them. And stuff about language is one of those things that I really want to know. My thinking was that because people had the option to be interviewed in any language of their choosing, those 500 plus who chose to be interviewed in Yiddish, I would suspect that they were like, robust Yiddish speakers. As for the effects of, dialect mixing or these kinds of like dialect of the shul, or those things exist. I don't know, I can't say anything super informative about it, except that those are things I think about.
I've just been told we are okay to go a little past 12:30 Pacific, and I see that Rachel has her hand up. So you have the floor. I'm asking you to unmute.
All right, thanks so much for a great talk, Chaya. I was wondering about what oo is doing here and how that might affect its position from the in terms of oo fronting going on sort of in the English and the surrounding area. Just looking at the data you posted, I'm not seeing a lot of oo fronting, but I'm wondering if that might be something interesting going on with, what is the spectral space for these vowels?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. When I first sent Bill Haddikin, who's my supervisor for my dissertation supervisor, a plot of these peripheral vowels from my word list data from the New York speakers, his first reaction was like, whoa, those oos are so backed. And I was like, yeah, I could tell you that. I didn't have to plot them to know that people in my community, for the most part, are not really fronting their oos. And so that's something that I talk about when I do bilingual comparisons and showing that. So there's some oo fronting coming in the absolute youngest generation that I've interviewed, which is generation 4. They're coming in from the English, unsurprisingly. But it's very, very, it's at a very preliminary stage, I would say, and even those fronted oos. So I'm seeing, I don't want to, I mean, I could go on about this, but so there were like a handful of people that I interviewed here in New York that had this like very obvious oo fronting. And so my question was, what's going on with these people? Why are they different? Which led me into a whole new area where I started looking at something that I'm calling Hasidic Orientation and how oriented people are within or towards like out of the community, which is something that I'm exploring and that I will be including in my dissertation. But I don't know if that answers your question, but I think the jury's still out on what's happening, but those are the things I can say right now.
Yeah, that's sort of what I suspected, that it's likely some sort of network effect, and it would be interesting to explore. Sounds great.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much.
We have another question in the chat, although it's from Isaac. So do you want to say it out loud since you can unmute yourself?
Oh, just a comment that you mentioned in the talk that some of the historical oos were fronted to E, and that's not phonemic E in Yiddish. So I wonder if that might take some of the pressure off to front the oos from historical O.
Yeah, I mean, so we don't have these true minimal pairs in the oo pair as we do for the E because of, wait, so no, you're referring to the oos fronted to E. Oh, okay, sorry, right.
Yeah, if they're fronting their oos, then maybe everything will become E over time, and that's not a sustainable linguistic system.
Yeah, I mean, sure, exactly like you said, historically, that's exactly what happened. Those oos became rounded and then fronted, and then they merged, and then we have like it's pretty unbelievable how many minimal pairs just like converged in that way. Yeah.
I think Greek might like a word about what's sustainable in terms of everything going to E. If there are no further questions, I don't see any hands up in the Q&A, then I'm going to wrap this up. I want to thank everyone for participating. This was 3 excellent talks, and this has been Sociolinguistics IV. So looking forward to the rest of the conference with all of you, and thank you for your time.